Welcome to the debate. The source material we're examining today offers a really rigorous, almost systematic blueprint for what it calls dangerous confidence. It's a forceful rejection of the whole self-help world of affirmations and positive thinking, which it actually calls a psychologically destructive delusion.
Mm-hmm. It's pretty direct.
It is. Instead, it posits that confidence is a purely functional, learnable skill, something rooted in, verifiable evidence and actual competence.
And that really brings us to the core of our debate today. The central question is, does this systematic, evidence-based approach completely eliminate the need for something like subjective belief or willpower?
Exactly. Is it all just a mechanism, or are elements of, say, internal trust essential for the system to even function? My position is that the material really proves confidence is fundamentally a systematic competence. It's built solely on accumulated evidence and, a track record of handling things. We're talking about an operating system, not a philosophy.
And I'm coming at it from a slightly different angle. I agree that competence is the foundation. That's non-negotiable. You can't build on nothing. But if you look closely at the more advanced parts of this dangerous confidence, things like emotional regulation or cognitive reframing, they seem to rely very heavily on these subjective acts of will and trust. Things that go beyond just objective capability.
Well, the core thesis of the material is, I'd say, unyielding on this. Confidence is a skill. It's based on knowing you have the psychological tools to handle challenges, not feeling good about yourself. Subjective belief without proof is explicitly called out as dangerous, mainly because the subconscious only seems to respond to hard evidence and data.
So how do you build it then in this model?
It's through something called competence stacking. Just the consistent incremental development of genuine, specific skills until confidence it happens automatically. The material promises that your subconscious, quote, can't argue with genuine competence. And this isn't just philosophical, it's neurological. It's described as a predictable process trained through, neuroplasticity and progressive exposure. You are literally rewiring your brain based on the actual experience of surviving challenges. If the confidence is built on objective data points, the need for that subjective willpower should eventually just disappear.
Okay, that's an interesting point. I would frame it a bit differently, though. While you're right that competence is the engine, the application of this dangerous confidence relies on what I'd call subjective mental technologies, acts of trust, acts of reinterpretation that have to be deployed before you've really established that competence. I mean, think about one of the core lies the material debunks. The whole idea of believing in yourself. The text is very clear that real confidence isn't about believing in some vague potential. It's about trusting your ability to figure things out as you go.
Right.
That very idea of trust is a deliberate, forward-looking commitment. It's a subjective choice you make that grants you, and this is a key phrase, permission to not have all the answers. You have to deploy that trust to even start the stacking process, long before all the objective evidence is piled up. And what's more, the confident person has to act in spite of fear. That transition from fear to action is courage, an act of will. That has to happen before the systematic desensitization can even begin.
But if confidence truly comes from a track record, from verifiable evidence, why do we need these subjective commitments? My argument is that if we continually prove our capability, the need for a subjective act of trust just diminishes over time because it's replaced by verifiable knowing. The process becomes the proof. You don't need to trust that you can solve a problem if you've already solved 50 increasingly complex versions of it. The evidence in your own nervous system takes over.
I see the distinction you're drawing, yeah. But here's where I'd push back. The internal enemy, self-doubt, doesn't really respect the data. The source text itself says that self-doubt uses classic psychological warfare, catastrophizing, personalization, all-or-nothing thinking. It can take 99 pieces of positive evidence and just demolish them with one negative data point.
Sure, but the system accounts for that.
It does, but how? To combat this, the system prescribes these high-level mental skills like cognitive diffusion or demanding an evidence standard against your own internal stories. But applying that standard requires conscious, subjective filtering. Let's unpack cognitive diffusion, because it's crucial here. It's the difference between saying, "I am a failure," and recognizing, "I am having the thought that I might fail." The ability to separate yourself from the thought, to see it as just a mental event, not a truth, that's not an automatic result of competence. It's a deliberate, learned mental discipline. The individual has to choose to apply what's called learned optimism, to view bad things as temporary and specific instead of just passively accepting the negative data from their own anxious brain. It's a high-level cognitive maneuver.
I agree it's a high-level skill, but it's still a trainable skill. The material puts these mechanisms squarely inside the emotional regulation component, which is developed systematically, like learning to play an instrument. You are trained to separate thought from fact, to evaluate the source of criticism. Is it credible? Is it useful? And to subject all that external input to a rigorous, evidence-based evaluation. The goal is cognitive immunity, and that is achieved by systematically applying techniques, not by just willing a shift in your mindset on some random Tuesday. It's the result of systematic programming. That is the very definition of competence.
Okay, but let's talk about the highest state described in the material, because this is where the competence-only argument for me starts to falter. If competence is purely competence-based, why are emotional regulation and even reality distortion, the ability to set the energy in a room and remain centered regardless of external circumstances, why are those listed as core components? The text describes an unshakable inner certainty that you can maintain even when objective reality is messy or, catastrophic. A business venture might be collapsing, but you remain calm. That requires a profound emotional independence. How can that be based purely on competence when the immediate external evidence, the loss, the failure, is clearly negative? It suggests a core non-performance-based self-worth is at play.
That profound internal independence you're describing, that is the highest expression of the system, yes. But it emerges naturally from integrating competence, calibration, and regulation. That unshakable self-worth isn't arbitrary. The text tells us exactly how it's built. By separating identity from results and clarifying core values, these are still systematic, logical steps. For instance, you're instructed to evaluate yourself based on effort and process. Did I prepare thoroughly? Did I act according to my values? Rather than judging yourself on the outcome alone. Think of it like a professional trader who sticks perfectly to their disciplined strategy. If the market crashes, they lose money, yes, but they don't lose confidence, because the evidence they rely on is their own adherence to process. They succeeded in following the plan. That internal stability is still rooted in verifiable process integrity, which is a form of systematic evidence.
I'm not entirely convinced by that, because it still requires an initial philosophical choice, the choice to value your process over the external success the world rewards. But let's pivot to the initial ignition of the system, fear alchemy. You correctly emphasize progressive exposure, where fear is managed through systematic, controlled steps. We call it stress inoculation.
Exactly. We're training the limbic system incrementally, weakening its threat perception with verifiable data until the prefrontal cortex can take over. You don't overwhelm the system, that just reinforces trauma.
Right. But here is the central point about subjective will. Before any of those progressive steps can even begin, the material instructs you to use fear as fuel, to consciously reframe arousal as excitement. Physiologically, fear and excitement are almost identical. Fast heart rate, adrenaline, focused attention. The difference between an anxiety attack and peak performance is purely the psychological interpretation. You have to consciously choose to tell yourself, my body is getting ready, I'm excited, instead of the default, I'm nervous, something is about to go wrong. That initial reframe is an instantaneous act of subjective will. It's necessary to even step onto the progressive exposure track. If you fail to reframe, the fear wins and the systematic skill building never starts. The mind has to control the narrative first.
I would just frame that differently. That reframe is a practice technique. It's a mechanism in the toolkit. Yes, it starts as a conscious choice, but through consistent rehearsal and visualization, it becomes automatic. This is the core of neuroplasticity. When an athlete visualizes success, when they deliberately practice associating a high heart rate with excitement. They are programming their brains. The will we're talking about quickly goes from being this arduous existential choice to a highly trained automatic neurological response. It's just a psychological application of systematic training. The difference between us is whether we see that initial conscious effort as a philosophical act or just the first trainable step in a process designed to automate confidence. I maintain it's the latter.
But that initial effort, especially when the evidence is still thin, requires a leap of faith, or, well, an act of trust in the system itself. The first time someone steps into a stressful situation, they have no prior data, only fear. To consciously choose that optimistic reframe, to believe the system will work and that they can act in spite of that fear, is a foundational act of commitment. Without that subjective decision to throw the power switch, the wheels of the competence stacking machine simply don't turn.
So, to summarize, I think you're right that true confidence, as it's laid out here, is a rigorous, trainable operating system. It's based on hard evidence, skill building, and psychological armor. This model offers a resilient path precisely because it relies on objective competence and process integrity, not fleeting emotion. It automates competence so willpower can be saved for other things.
And while I think that competency model is powerful and fundamentally necessary, its efficacy is implemented and maintained by these high-level subjective mental technologies. The core ability to trust your capacity to adapt, to reframe adversity, and to act in spite of fear, these are crucial recurring acts of will. This suggests that the most powerful form of dangerous confidence is an internal mastery, a sort of philosophical commitment to your chosen process that guides but isn't fully defined by objective competence.
The journey from insecurity to certainty is clearly structured and mapped, providing a path for anyone.
But the persistence needed to walk that path, especially when results are slow, is sustained by internal commitment, by that subjective interpretation.
Psychology described in the source material, leaving us to really appreciate the delicate and dynamic interplay between objective skill and conscious internal belief.